And then 32. Don't know if you read that. And I am on day 5 of being OOO. Trying to use this time to spend more time with myself and figure out next steps for a career transition. So I thought I would share what my day looks like. I am a big fan of walking, so I am going to walk on over to an art supply store in Williamsburg to pick up some pencils and erasers for my painting. And then afterwards I'm gonna go to a used bookstore to see if I can find any good reads.
Baby, you don't know what you do to me. Between me and you, I feel a chemistry. I won't let no one come and take your place. Cause the love you give, it can't be replaced. So no one else can do. That's why I spend my life with you. I won't please you in any way I can. I wanna share my world, don't you understand? Your love is a one in a million. It goes on and on and on. You give all day long.
I just wanted to talk about these Kellogg's Special K protein cereal. I just got it because it sounded healthier, but I am absolutely in love. I think it might be my favorite cereal now. The thing about cereal and me is that I feel so pressured to eat it immediately because I hate soggy cereal, and I almost do this thing where I put in drops of cereal, eat it, drops of cereal, eat it. But with this cereal, I don't know how they made it, but it is sturdy enough. Probably not the best descriptor, but it stays intact and not soggy, even though I let it sit in the milk for like 5 minutes, which is unheard of in the cereal world. So if you, like me, are a hater, or not a hater, but do not like soggy cereal and love protein or want more protein in your life, I highly recommend this. This is not sponsored, but should be. This is my roommate Jamie and her drawing.
It took me a really long time to learn that drawing is not.
And now we have dinner. I know. Today I am with one of my dearest friends, Stewart, in her lovely Brooklyn home to learn about how she views career, how she's pursued it, and to explore more of her artwork.
My name is Asia Stewart and I'm a performance artist based in Brooklyn, New York. If you're asking what does performance art mean or what does performance art entail, I think artists all define that differently. For me, I try to use my body to physicalize like abstract theories related to race, gender, sexuality, class, and I try to use my body to bring them to life and to really represent what does it mean to embody those things.
For some of the viewers who don't really have the personal history that I have with you, how did you become the artist that you are today?
After I graduated from Harvard, I went to the University of Cambridge, where I received my master's degree in the sociology of marginality and exclusion.
Wow.
And I was doing a lot of research on immigration and human rights, and what does it mean to belong, and how do Black immigrants in the UK make a home in a hostile environment.
You've always struck me as someone who has this really strong and functional internal compass that directs your life. Going then off of your, highly educated background, I think that's a blessing but also a curse because it carries its own baggage of expectations, right? What people think your life should look like, what career you should pursue. Have you heard those things around from people you love and maybe not so much love? How does that impact you?
I'm lucky to have really supportive parents, and while she was alive, my grandmother really supported me and encouraged me. But at the same time, I think they wanted what was best for me, and in their eyes, they wanted me to have security down the line. And art isn't always viewed as the most stable or secure career. And so throughout various stages of my life, there wasn't ever a time until now that I've only been performing, and I've directed all of my energy and labor really into performance and art making. People I know now have a stable job, a stable career, they have an income, they have savings, and that's definitely not the case for me. But I think what's guided me throughout various moments in my life and to get me to where I am now has just been me returning to what makes me really want to get out of bed in the morning. There will never be a moment when I will become bored of what I do, and I tried, I've done many different legal internships for a long time. I also thought I was going to go to law school many years ago, and it just doesn't engage me or fulfill me in the same way as being able to create my own work, being able to write my own pieces, being able to direct myself and have control over how my body's even used on stage too. I think I appreciate everyone's guidance and love and interest in me in my career, but I really knew I had to follow my instincts.
Different artists have different schedules or different relationships to their art. How do you art?
How do I art?
Yeah.
It's definitely changed depending on the stage of my life, where I was, what I was doing at the time, because I always had to balance it with practical concerns of how am I making money this month, how am I paying for rent. My schedule now, so I also, in addition to working as an artist, I also am a teacher and tutor, and so I get to 6, I'll tutor for half the day and then transition and try to spend 5 or 6 hours every day focusing on my art. So that could be editing a piece or performance, that could be me writing, that could be applying to grants and residencies. That takes up a lot of time too. But if there's something that sticks with me in the moment, it'll go in my notes app, and then eventually it'll go into a longer document.
There is this hesitation or unwillingness for people to associate structure with the arts, right? We want it to be a spark of creativity and they're the chosen ones who do it. But what I'm hearing is that you do work at it, but there are also spurts of creativity where something just hits you, something gets you, and it's you're in there. How do you keep yourself motivated?
I don't know. I guess it depends on the project, but a lot of my work I think relates to my family, and I think I have to give a lot of credit to my grandmother and my mother who raised me, and they sacrificed so much. So that now I have the freedom and privilege to try to create art. I feel that there is a mission for me to at least amplify some of the messages that are in my work, or to share those messages with people, and to know that if I'm creating a piece that's on internalized racism, or if I'm creating a piece that's reflecting on gender and how we've been often conditioned to perform our gender in particular ways that are quite restrictive and damaging and harmful, or making a piece reflecting on sexual violence and also forms of violence that we have been told don't classify as violence, that we've been told is part of the work for me is healing and restorative. I hope, to some extent, that even if there's one person who watches a performance or who looks at an image that I've created and it sticks with them and they continue to ask questions and they continue to wrestle with those themes after they viewed my work, like that to me, that means something. That's why I have to continue to do what it is that I'm doing. I just finished a project called No More Blue Mondays. It's like this 23-minute long video project.
I do that because every Monday is pretty blue for me. Unless I'm out of the office, you know?
And it's this piece that's reflecting on like white feminism, the gender division of labor, what forms of labor are expected from a woman's body. And it took a really long time. I am not really a video artist by training. I have never taken like a film class or even taken a class to learn how to really use a lot of like video technology. And it took me like six plus months to just work on, to comb through archival footage and to like piece my performance together. And it was really a matter of like every single day. I knew after the second I finished like tutoring, I needed to spend at least 4 to 5 hours working on that project. And does that always happen? No. I am not perfect. There are some days where I'm like, I cannot do this today.
You're like an overworker. Always an overworker.
To do this tomorrow, but I feel like there's so many different ways to also like do the work. Sometimes the work is reading a book. Sometimes it's just being a human in the world, being a person observing life and observing what's happening.
Can you explain a little bit more? Give me examples of what you meant when you said white feminism uplifts a white woman at the cost of women of color.
And I can even kind of do it through the piece No More Blue Mondays, because the piece actually follows different women going about their day from the moment they get out of bed to the moment they get back into bed. And it's all different women, and it's all archival clips that I pulled from the US public domain, and they're clips that created between basically mainly the 40s to the 80s. Now the entire domain it really only showcases white women and amplifies like their voice. And in a lot of these pieces, like you can see a woman who is complaining about the fact that she is a housewife, like is at home all day. But that's only a luxury that was really experienced by a lot of white women, because women of color, black and brown women, had to go work. They needed to support their families. They could not. Their households couldn't survive off of one income, single income, or in many cases because of the systems that we live in. If we think about like the carceral system, if we think about the ways in which black and brown men have also been targeted and criminalized, there are also situations in which there was only a single mother in the household and she had to work. And so at the same time that a lot of white women are saying, we want to get out of home, we want to free ourselves, there are already black and brown women who are working, who are already there. And then when we think about...
Like, boo, we were here 20 years ago. Sorry.
And then when you think about, okay, what does it take then for those white women who want to leave the home? How does the home itself, you think about like reproductive labor, which doesn't just refer to the act of human reproduction, but the act of what's sustaining a household, what's the care work that's being performed. If she leaves and goes to work, who's taking care of the kids, who's cleaning the house? And that's black and brown women who've been hired as help. And so like that's just kind of one little example of that process.
And just to play devil's advocate, not that these are my personal beliefs, couldn't it be argued then that white feminism is actually helping women of color, because now it's creating a new space in the economy for black and brown bodies to inhabit, right? Like domestic work, now we're giving them more jobs, right? How do you see that then?
I guess my counter would be that a lot of that work, which also I guess would often be defined as or referred to as like informal labor, that has always existed and will always exist, and it is unfortunately often foisted upon like black and brown femmes. I would also say that a lot of what I think gets celebrated when people reflect on feminist movements is, right, okay, so now women are able to get better jobs, women are able to climb the ladder, able to break the glass ceiling, but that sort of progress has always been barred to Black and brown women.
Yeah.
So just because there is a new avenue, a new channel for advancement for white women doesn't mean that that has been extended or passed on to anyone else.
Yeah.
There's this really great poem by Audre Lorde. So it's called Who Said It Was Simple? There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. Sitting in netics, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. An almost white counterman passes a waiting brother to serve them first, and the ladies neither notice nor reject the slighter pleasures of their slavery. But I, who am bound by my mirror, as well as my bed, see causes in color as well as sex, and sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations.
I think that also gets at the heart of what you were saying on like feminism.
Yeah.
Coming at the cost.
Yeah, the problematic girls they hire to make themselves.
I know that
Yeah,
line
that
really hit me.
Yeah, and I think it's because I think a lot of people discount, and I'm certainly not the first to say this, but this has been said time and time and time again, but I think it's ignored how interlocking all of these systems are, right? You could not have, like, our understanding of modernity, so much of that is linked to racism and slavery, right? And so, like, we have so much of what dictates our systems, the systems that we live in today, it's the interconnectivity between racism, sexism, the class structure, capitalism. Thinking about something I've been reflecting on is compulsory heterosexuality, and thinking about, right, when we think about sexuality and how that's tied to who and what the state is trying to reproduce, who and what the state is trying to reproduce. All of these things, unfortunately, are connected. And it's when someone is like, I'm going to free myself from people who look like me in this particular condition. And it's hard to overlook all the small acts of violence that we're complicit in, you know?
Yeah. Definitely. I think part of me, I get into this state of paralysis. Because it's like I don't even know the extent to how interconnected everything is. But I, as much as I am a victim of these acts of violence, these microaggressions, I am also a cause of them, right? I cannot go through this world without hurting other people.
Yeah.
It's just part of my being. And so sometimes I'm paralyzed as to what am I called to do as both a direct victim but also an ally, right? Who will also, in my allyship, hurt the people I'm supposed to be allied with. It's just, and I think there are so many things in our conversation that I could relate with, and I'm like, oof, like, oh my lord, I know, but so many, I'm even cautious of expressing those things because I, as an Asian American woman, am much closer to whiteness than a black woman is. So for me, I'm almost like, am I allowed to say that I feel some type of way, or like I get some of it, without, does that erase their experiences, or does that kind of trivialize or minimize that?
I don't think, I mean, granted, I'm only one person, but I don't think it does, right? Because you're not thinking about the privileges that I have, right? That you haven't had, and because when we think about our, varying identities that we have, and I think something that I agree with that you said is that as we move through the world, unfortunately, the way that the world has been created, we will commit small acts of violence on a regular basis. I think, and I hear what you're saying about feeling paralyzed by that, because I do too, right? Like, how do I go buy food from the grocery store when I'm so disconnected from, like, who are where that food even came from.
The labor,
right? Or the
behind that.
labor being disconnected from the labor that's being performed.
Yeah.
What happens when you know, just moving through the world? There's all this violence that we've become complicit in, and some of it's violence that we are tied to in an attempt to survive ourselves, which is it's very upsetting. I think what moves me is trying to find ways to limit the amount of harm I'm responsible for, and then also to think about, okay, how can I not rectify, but like what are ways that, not just like reducing and limiting it, but how can I make it so that I don't have to do that again, right? Like, and when we think about healing and justice, like, just, I think moving in that direction, like that has to mean something.
Yeah.
But I just think, you know, we live in a very, very fucked up world, and I think it would be almost impossible when you think about the repercussions and the consequences of every single thing that we do. So much of the system, this world, is built on violence, right? Capitalism is built on violence, and these, you know, what allows the United States to continue a lot of the things that the state thrives on and relies on is crisis and lack. So
Power, because that creates power, right? Power
and a gradient.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do we move against that? And I don't have answers for any of these things, but I do think that you absolutely, as an Asian American woman, can relate to in many ways. Like, there are so many experiences that you've had that I have not had, and there are many experiences that I will never be able to understand, like, and you will never be able to understand from me, and yet we can, like, sit here and have this conversation. We can be, something that I've really liked, I read recently, is not using the phrase like allies, but be co-conspirators, right? Like, how can we conspire together and work together?
I love that.
Against, right, this sort of white supremacist,
I love that.
cishet state.
Wow.
Can we be co-conspirators?
Yes, we absolutely can. We absolutely can.
Well, I never heard that before in this context, and I love it. I think that reframes my mind, because when I think about allyship and being an ally, it's almost, I always think about it as a negative act of how do I do the least violence, right? Whereas co-conspiring and co-conspiracy really brings me to like a positive space of how do I relate, how do I push back. Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You would be one person I would, without second thought, point to when I think of resilient. And you experienced that firsthand, especially with the pandemic. Earlier on in 2020, when we had met, you were auditioning for different plays and off-Broadway shows. You had performances lined up that were continually getting delayed, almost indefinitely. Grants kind of going out the door, and still in the face of that, I think if I were in your position, first sight of any kind of obstacle like that, I'd be like, all right, let's find myself a job. I need a job. I need to get out of this. But you're still here today. It is 2021. What is it? August 23rd, 2021. More than a year into the pandemic, and you've pivoted. You've made new with the limitations that you've had. What was that process of, oh my gosh, I've trained since 10 years old to be a classical or a traditional performance artist in like musical theater or opera, and now I'm going into this avant-garde experimental stuff. Like, what was that process like for you?
It was definitely, I had many moments of like personal crisis of like, what am I doing? I mean, I still even asked myself that many times this year, like, what am I doing? But yeah, for a long time, I envisioned myself, like, the dream was Broadway. Yeah. And I think a moment of crisis too was like, what happens if that is no longer the dream? The pandemic really forced me to pause for a second and say, is this what I want to do? Or am I doing it because I always told myself I would be doing it? Someone asked me actually, like, Asia, what's your dream role? And I was like, I don't have a dream role. Like, there's when I don't really listen to musical soundtracks anymore, and I, have adored many musicals and plays that I've seen, like, on Broadway, off Broadway, but I was like, there's something that I, like, want to be in right now. Like, that's not where the fire is for me, even though I still want to be moving and creating and performing. There has to be another way for me to do that. And I also wanted to combine a lot of my academic pursuits. It actually wasn't really until the summer, so around this time last year, maybe July, August 2020, an opportunity came up and someone asked me to present work for like a virtual showcase. And she was like, Asia, do you want to sing? And I was like, actually, I've been doing a lot of writing, doing a lot of reflecting. I have all these projects I want to do and want to create. I don't have a budget. And they're a bit experimental.
Yeah.
And I was like, what if we went with that? And she was like, Asia, go for it.
Yeah.
And I decided to go for it. And that was my first performance, La Negresse Blanche. That's one where I covered my body in white paint and glue. I let it dry, I sort of peeled and stripped it off, and then I ate it. And it was this whole piece about internalized racism and how double consciousness.
So good!
And that piece, I mean, thinking about limitations, was middle of the pandemic. I don't have a studio. I don't really have money, money to separately fund a performance. And but we found a way to put it together. Limitations can be very generative, and I also think there are a lot of...
I love that. Limitations can be generative.
And I think there are a lot of Black and brown artists and artists of color and of marginalized identities who haven't had so many privileges, who haven't had opportunities waiting for them. They've had to like fight and claw their way for those things. And I think when you have a vision and you want to bring that vision to life, and you know that you have to find a way to do that, you will find a way to do that. And I think it's in the act of trying to figure out, how am I going to put this together? Like that ingenuity, that's where that comes in.
It's very validating for me. I don't identify as an artist, but
you are.
I'm not an artist. But I do love the arts, and I've just been mulling over one of the things that you've said is that ingenuity that comes from marginalized folks. And maybe it's because you mentioned the glue that you used in your first experimental piece, but I remember in the second or third grade we had those like tri-board poster projects that we had, and I don't know why, but my household, we just didn't have glue. We didn't have Elmer's glue. And this project was due the next day. Here I am scrambling. I'm like, what am I gonna do? I'm an A+ student. I need my A. And I ended up using like rice pebbles, rice kernels as glue, right? And
got the starch.
Yeah, exactly. And that for me, I think about limitations and how they've molded me into a more creative person, because I've had so many limitations. But it's also interesting because I was so embarrassed of my lack of resources and the ways in which I had to reinvent for it. And I think that's where my timidness towards the arts comes from, because my substitution of glue with the rice, that was a form of that was a signifier of my lack, of my poverty. Not poverty, but and that was something I was told to be ashamed of, and not something I was applauded as, like, what a creative girl.
Yeah.
And I think even that, like how you frame different acts by different people, maybe that also helps to then shape the art world as white as it is today.
Yes.
You know what I mean? To say, oh, like what you did there, that was because you were poor. That's not because you were creative. Whereas, like, if someone who had the means did the same thing, they were like, oh my gosh, like, what a creative girl, brilliant, you know?
Yeah. Someone walks in, oh, I I studied the properties of rice and noticed that the starch really would really help, would serve as a great adhesive.
Oh my lord!
Everyone
my
loves you.
lord! Excusing me, I was doing that in the 3rd grade, so tell me again.
I do think that art is, in a way, a very selfish and simultaneously selfless act. You know, you're selfish in that there's so much of your past that you're trying to unpack and trying to make sense of.
Yeah.
But you're also reaching out for someone else who might have had that shared experience, and with the hope that you starting to hammer away at these themes will be able to touch another soul.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where the selfless part comes out. With your most recent work, because you do have something new, I would just love to hear more about what led to it, the inspiration.
Something that connects a lot of my pieces is that I will perform very simple movements on loop. So it's a lot of looped behaviors, a lot of looped actions, and repeating them to the point of absurdity. But I think it really mirrors the absurdity of a lot of the systems and structures that we live in that dictate and oppress us on a daily basis.
Yes!
My first piece is what I mentioned earlier, Limited Blanche, and that was really just an act of mourning, really. It was so the name is in French, it translates to the white negress, and it's the title is inspired by a book written by Mayot Compesha, whose work is cited in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass. You know, throughout various moments in my life, I've always been in predominantly white spaces, and particularly as a child, I saw that when I was in those spaces, there was a certain capital that I didn't have access to, which was whiteness. Right? There was a certain social capital, and I wanted to be viewed as attractive. I wanted to be viewed as desirable, and I wasn't. And I saw the people who were, and I was like, and I was this all like me going home and calculating? Oh, I need to do this. I need to do that. No, but I think over time I shed and lost a lot of aspects of my blackness in an attempt to fit in an attempt to survive in those spaces. And so the piece was really me reflecting on who could I have been if I had not done that, and then also me rejecting that prior way of thinking, right? That the old thoughts that I had to be ashamed of myself or of my history, or that I needed to fit in. When in fact I should have been rejecting everything that I was being subjected to, you know, and that's what that.
But how do you, when you're like a 6-year-old girl, or like in middle school, high school, when all you want to be is loved and seen and belong, like how do you reject it? You can't.
Yeah. And so that's what I mean. So that piece, I was really inspired also by looking at Frantz Fanon and his work. I was also thinking about one of my favorite books, which is Louis Die by Toni Morrison. I read that when I was very young. My grandmother gave it to me. It's very personal work, and so that really motivated that first piece. At that time, I wasn't really even thinking about the next 2 performances. It was really just that first work, and the name Graft came from how do we literally and also metaphorically change and mold our skin, you know, because due to those constructions. And then the second piece and third piece came along. The second piece, as I said earlier, was really reflecting on gender and what types of work are expected of women's bodies, what type of labor is expected from femmes, but also who is expected to perform that labor, right? And so if we look at our class structure, class system, when we think about capitalism, and when we think about feminism and so-called emancipation, a lot of emancipatory practices that have been carried out by white women have only ended up entrapping and further oppressing women of color. And so that in that piece, I bind my body to an ironing board, and I used over like 100 different nylon stockings, which is also both objects, the ironing board and the stockings, are symbols of domesticity, of femininity, and also what does it mean to be, I think, for such a long time, women of color, namely through like my experience as Black women, have not been seen as women, because woman was synonymous with white women and womanhood someone's ability to access that was contingent on whiteness. And so the ways in which black and brown women have had to try to fit their bodies into these systems, try to be seen as feminine, to try to be seen as desirable, that piece was also reflecting on that. And so by the end of the piece, I'm literally in almost like a mummy. I've been sort of mummified by those objects. The third piece is called Gorgides, which I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. There was an explorer who went down, who, according to the myth, sailed down somewhere in Africa and encountered these people who were covered in hair. And he killed those people and skinned their bodies to bring back their hair back to wherever he was coming from. And so when I created that piece, I was really thinking about body hair and the relationship between hair, how hair is racialized, and also how hair is gendered.
Yeah.
And there's this one experience, it's like looking back now I laugh, but at the time I was like 10 years old, and I was not shaving like under my arms. And I remember in class, I was very much like type A. Like,
yeah, you are!
I would raise my hand all the time. And I was in home economics class, and which is just,
I know. What a fun, yeah.
Take me back to the
1950s. Take me back.
And I remember there were two guys who I thought were my friends, and they started making monkey sounds. And they were laughing because under my arms there was hair. I was hairy, and my legs were hairy, and essentially calling me a monkey, which also, of course, has completely, racial connotations too. But thinking about, okay, so what does it mean? What if I took this to the extreme, right? What if I covered my entire body in thick black hair?
Yeah.
What does that person become? What does that subject become? And so by the end of that performance, I'm this monstrous subject, but I think also a subject who is content with her monstrosity. And in that piece, I'm like performing domestic tasks. I have like a broom in hand. I'm like braiding my hair. I'm combing my hair, brushing my hair.
Yeah.
And that piece was a lot of fun.
How do you become bulletproof against a society that tells you you're wrong? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. I mean,
I don't.
It's hard.
Yeah.
I don't think you ever necessarily do. I just think you learn how to withstand. You learn how to withstand that to some extent. I mean, even whenever I publish a performance, I'm terrified, right? I think also
that's so surprising because you do not seem like it at all. You know?
No, like I mean, in a lot of my performances, I'm nude. At least nude at some point in the performance. Even if I'm doing a live performance, I'm putting my physical body on stage to be scrutinized.
He's so confident. I'm like, that's Asia. That's Asia.
And it's made me very vulnerable. But also, I'm just like, I've committed to this. I'm not saying that everyone who watches my work needs to like it. I doubt that will be the case. That will ever be the case. But they are seeing it, right? It is visible.
You're starting a conversation.
Yeah, and I think, visibility can be a trap. Okay, sorry. No, I said visibility. I don't want to offend any ears, but I'm just like, fuck it. Like, if so many people, particularly white people, white creators, who have been encouraged for years to release various types of art and media, if they can do it, I will continue to do it, you know?
So with that, we will conclude for today. Asia, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about these very intimate things, right? And opening up your space, your art, your mind, your heart. I love you.
I love you too.
Wow, this is so beautiful. I think even these conversations are art, right? Yeah, really.
But I ain't see myself another girl like you. This ring.